I am Lindsay Nell-Rabinowitz, and I serve as the director of the Faith in Action Project. It is my honor to introduce to you Reverend Dr. David Malott. David is the CTS president. He is also a theologian, a teacher, a spiritual director, and an author of 2 books. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Lindsay. And welcome everyone to the 5th annual Faith in Action Fall event. As you can see, the coronavirus has not stopped or decreased the commitment of Christian Theological Seminary to mitigating poverty in our community. On the contrary, we have stepped up to do even more. Christian Theological Seminary launched the Faith in Action Project 5 years ago with a sense of urgency, eager to spark a revolution of hope and to be a catalyst for addressing poverty and social injustices. That urgency remains. In fact, the pandemic and the racial inequality that persist in our nation have increased that urgency, pushing us even more to highlight the ways that through quality education, affordable housing, accessible healthcare, and a network of support, our community can drive toward equity and social justice for all. To that end, we gather, even while keeping our distance, to engage our faith, our minds, our wills, and our hands to work toward the end of poverty in our city. We gather to hear both national and local perspectives, and we gather to point the way toward solutions. We are thrilled to have award-winning documentarian, journalist, and author Soledad O'Brien, anchor and special correspondent for CNN. We're also grateful for our friends and local leaders, Alicia Johnson, Superintendent of Indianapolis Public Schools, Indiana's largest public school district, Tony Mason, President of the Indianapolis Urban League, and Yecenia Tostado, Executive Director of Project Azul. We want to thank the Central Indiana Community Foundation for their support of our 5th annual Faith in Action Fall event, and for the Mike and Sue Smith Family Fund for their overall support of Christian Theological Seminary. And now, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Leah Gunning Francis, the Vice President of Academic Affairs and Dean of the Faculty at CTS, who will be moderating the conversation with Soledad.
Pleasure today to welcome Soledad O'Brien. Through the power of storytelling, Soledad O'Brien brings a fresh perspective on diverse and contemporary issues to foster change in your own community or organization. As the host of Sunday morning's syndicated political show, Matter of Fact with Soledad O'Brien, Soledad has established herself as one of the most recognized names in broadcasting by telling the stories behind the most important issues, people, and events of the day. A champion of diversity, she gives voice to the underserved and disenfranchised through her Emmy-winning reporting and acclaimed documentary series, Black in America and Latino in America, while also appearing as host on PBS NewsHour and HBO's Real Sports with Bryant Gumbel as a correspondent. A prominent philanthropist, Soledad is the founder of Powerful, a foundation that mentors and funds college tuition expenses for young women. She is a graduate of Harvard University and currently lives with her husband, Brad, and their 4 children in Manhattan. Welcome, Soledad. We are delighted to have you with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, let's just jump right into it. I'd like for you to begin by sharing some of your perspectives and insights on how you see our country reckoning with the recent healthcare crisis and racial unrest, and how today's realities create new opportunities to address poverty in a deeper way.
Thank you, and I'm happy to take a look at this from the sort of 35,000-foot view of the national picture, and I'm glad that you're talking about sort of new opportunities because I am an optimist, and some of the statistics we're going to talk about are pretty dire, but I do think coming through those statistics and coming through a lot of that bad news that many of us are seeing and living, there are some opportunities. I'm a realist, but there are some opportunities. So I think first and foremost, it's unclear at this moment if what the government is doing to try to help people who've been affected primarily by the pandemic is going to offset the losses that we have seen in the economy. And those losses, as you well know, over-index for people of color. So, for example, we know that the net worth of white people on average is around $835, $126 for Black people, and $166 for Latino household net worth, right? So you're looking overall at a sort of already a wide wealth disparity. We know that 15% of white people have a zero or a negative net worth. We know that 40% of Black families have a zero or negative net worth. I mean, let's just let that sit there for a minute. 40% of Black families have a zero or negative net worth. So if you're layering in the long tail of a pandemic on that, you can see that the potential it's already disastrous. The potential to fall even further behind is very, very high. So when you look at both the pandemic and this aftermath of what has been really a summer of racial unrest, I think it's really, really challenging. I think the government response so far has been chaotic, not enough. And by government, I mean federal government, and you see individual states as well trying to come up with their own specific pandemic relief strategies. But from where I sit, I don't see local governments completely prepared for what's coming down the pike. People talk about the second wave. We're heading into winter and flu season, which will be correlated with the second wave. But speaking from New York City, I don't see some real strategy, because that strategy is around vaccines, right? And the strategy is around medications, and the strategy, this is on the coronavirus side. So I think that's just a lot of bad news and not a lot that we see at this moment for what could fix coronavirus / the economic impacts of coronavirus. That said, where do I see opportunity? And I actually believe there is opportunity, because sometimes I think until people start having these conversations, both around social justice and around the things that are the impacts from coronavirus. So we know this devastating economic picture for Blacks and Latinos and people of color generally. We are deep in those conversations today. And the people who are deep in those conversations aren't the traditional, I'm a philanthropist who cares about this issue, or I care about social justice. I think that's a conversation that every American at this moment is trying to navigate. For a lot of white people, they are for the first time really beginning to understand some of the issues and having conversations about some of the issues around social justice. And I also think for a lot of people, as we have a large number of Americans who are out of work, are beginning to understand, how do we have a safety net? What does that safety net actually have to look like to make sure that people who temporarily are really struggling are helped and then can come back into the workplace? So in a way, some of this has made it all very real, and it's caused conversations. And I don't say that lightly. I do think that that's very important. I think getting people to focus on these issues that have in a lot of ways, not in a global pandemic, but in a lot of ways been around for a long time, and poverty's been around for a long time, to make people think about them, I think is a good thing. That's kind of the national picture, and I think it's a bit of a mixed bag.
Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, where is the face of poverty often unseen, even when it's right in front of us?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, we did this documentary that looked at the pandemic, specifically in Seattle, and it focused on what happens to people who are homeless, people who are in crisis when another crisis hits, right? And it was interesting to even hear from the people who are homeless that nobody really cared about their sanitary measures until there was a fear that maybe they could catch coronavirus from homeless people. No one worried too much about where there were bathrooms. Is there a place they could wash their hands? Should they move inside? Where could they live, right? Until suddenly it felt like, oh, this might impact the greater community, and now we suddenly care. And there are many people that we talk to who are quite bitter about that. I think is a fair way to put it. Just bitter that, you didn't care until my health affected your health. And then all of a sudden you cared if I had a place to go to the bathroom. And I think that is a bitter pill for many to swallow. But of course, as you well know, the face of poverty is often hidden. I, many years ago, proposed a documentary called Poverty in America. We'd been doing a lot of series, Black in America, Latino in America, education in America. And my own boss said, ugh, who would want to see that? Right? As if somehow the vision of poor people in America is like a hobo riding the rails with a little stick and a little pack. I mean, it was because we know in our reporting that there are plenty of people who are struggling. I mean, 40% of Black families have a zero net worth or lower than zero net worth. So I think that it's, this idea that there's this vision of poverty is understood by all is really not true. I think there are plenty of families that are regular families. They go to school with us, they work with us, they live near us, and they are struggling and possibly on the verge of falling down and falling under. And so I've tried hard as a journalist to push back on this idea that, I can look in the crowd and tell you who's what. That's just an utter fabrication. We know I did a story on a gentleman who worked in Congress, actually. He went to work with the senators and Congress people every day, and he was living in his car. And there have been several stories. Mine wasn't the only one, right? There are plenty of students who live in their cars near their campus so that they can attend school, but they cannot afford school and housing. So the documentary we just did about students who are hungry to learn is the name of the doc, are students who are trying to pay for their education, and it's expensive, but cannot afford to eat. And if you bumped into any of them on campus, they look like a college student. They have a backpack and they are running off to class. So this vision of, what it looks like, I think is just a misnomer. And it's been hard, even within a newsroom, to try to convince your colleagues sometimes of that, because I think the visual that they have is really, really flawed. That said, I think it's really important to also just talk about some of these numbers and these statistics and this data around where families financially are. If you can't come up with $400 for an emergency, no matter what house you live in, and if you have a car that you're driving to work, you have a huge financial risk and problem, and you are one step away from falling into poverty, one missed paycheck. And that means that when something like a pandemic happens, you are really, really on the edge and could fall through. We know the large number of people who've lost their jobs, right? Over-index in people of color, people in retail. And so we see that this struggle is really challenging to people who are not going to be able to go back into the economy and get a new job right away.
Right. And it impacts us in so many ways and on so many different levels. When the virus hit, and here in Indianapolis, I have school-age children, and like parents all around the country, they were, we're figuring out what to do with our kids and how to make things work. But one of the primary concerns of our largest school district here in Indiana was not only how to make sure that children can continue learning in the midst of this pandemic and e-learning, but at the same time, how will they be fed?
And it's insane when you think about it, right? To think we're having conversations about access to broadband, right? Are you going to be able to zoom in on your classroom, and will you be engaged by your teacher? And at the same time, in that same class, there's a whole other conversation about forget access to broadband. Where will you find food today? I mean, it's just insane that these are the conversations that we're having and that we're expecting children to learn in these conditions.
The faces of poverty are all around us. One of the other things that is a really pressing matter right now, we all know we're in the middle of a presidential election season, and we know that many civil rights groups, political commentators, everyday individuals have been continuing to raise issue and concern about voter suppression. What we know is that most often voter suppression disproportionately impacts people that are already disenfranchised. I'm interested to hear from you about your perspective on what's at stake for people that are living in poverty today in this next election. What's at stake?
So my husband and I run a foundation, and we send girls to school, and often the girls come from families that are in poverty. That's why they need our financial help. And so what you see for many of these families that they come from, and what is true certainly, I think, for people in poverty in general, is that any obstacle that's thrown up is very challenging to overcome, right? So if you shut down a polling place and you move it out of a nursing home, maybe because of coronavirus, can't do elections and have people vote in a nursing home anymore. And so let's say you close, as we know happened in Wisconsin, for example, we close a large number of these polling places. Be very clear that people who don't have access to vehicles, people who don't have access to extra gas, people who don't have control over their schedules, people who are working 3 jobs, people who can't say, it's election day, you know what, I am actually just not going to go in today, I'm going to work from home, or I got to swing by, go vote, I don't know if I'm going to be back in an hour, it might be 3 hours, right? Those are all incredible luxuries that if you have control over your schedule, you can actually, manage. But if you don't, if you have far to go now, and if far means 3 buses, not just pop in your car and go an extra 3 minutes, that can be problematic. And so all of these things that might to some people seem like no obstacle at all, actually, I think become these huge, overwhelming obstacles. And poor people, of course, have a huge stake in this election. How do we decide what are the policies and the principles and the values by which we are trying to solve some of the biggest problems that we are knee deep and in the middle of right now? So I do think that people will say, well, how hard is it to get an ID? Well, I don't know. Are you working 3 jobs? Do you have to do you not have the day off to go? Anybody who's gone to the DMV here in New York City knows. Leave some time, leave a lot of time, right? Well, if you have control over your schedule, you could do that. Oh, and be prepared to pay the fee to get all the stuff that you need in addition to waiting in line, which, so I think there are these very practical ways in which we're putting up obstacles to people who just don't have that extra ability. And I see it in my scholars all the time. It's sometimes for them, challenges in college, is death by 1,000 paper cuts. It's no one thing. And it's certainly not that they can't do the work. It's that they got a flat tire. And so that costs $60 to change. Oh, and then a book was returned late. So there's a fee for that. But the book was returned late because they couldn't get in that day because the car was in the shop, and you see them really struggling for these little, relatively small financial burdens that actually end up sinking them all together in many cases.
We often hear the term radical attached to concepts like, living wages and affordable access to comprehensive health care, and every child going to a school that is well-funded and resourced, and college students graduating without tens of thousands of dollars in debt. Why are these ideas considered radical by some?
So, for example, we know that we've restarted the conversation, I think, because of coronavirus around healthcare, right? I mean, this idea that people should have a right to healthcare, or at least we should want everybody to have healthcare to keep ourselves, even from a completely selfish perspective, boy, it keeps me healthier if everybody else on the subway with me also has the access to healthcare. We know now, because of coronavirus, I think some of those conversations have restarted. 10% of people, Black Americans, don't have the health care. We know that there are conversations now restarting about wages, right? Especially as we like to call the frontline workers, who are often low-wage workers. We love to call them heroes, so do we want to pay them as heroes? We really want to value them as heroes. Or are we just like #heroes? And that's enough. I think also we're beginning to understand the limits of the social safety net. And I think we know that unemployment and wage disparity, right? Those are the 2 pillars of poverty: unemployment, wage disparity. So I think all of those things have kind of opened up this new conversation. And I think when that happens, this idea of something being radical, when a large number of people have lost their jobs, or a large number of people would like to have a coronavirus test to be covered by health insurance if they had it, or a large number of people are really trying to understand about debt because they have a child who's going off to college, right? I think that undermines this framing of radical, because people are like, well, I don't feel particularly radical, but I'd like my kid not to come out of college with $60,000 worth of debt, which is kind of a standard number.
Currently, as you know, the Reverend William Barber has revived the Poor People's Campaign and has assembled a huge swath of people across the economic spectrum that are really mobilizing for social change going forward, saying that this is the kind of work, the economic, educational, health, immigration, safe streets, all of this is the work that we need to do for the well-being of our souls. I'm curious to hear you reflect a little bit on what has this work to do with our souls, and what would redemption look like?
I think the way to rehabilitate the soul is to rethink about kind of the mission. If you're fortunate enough to have been successful, certainly in the way I was raised, the immediate goal is then to turn around and figure out how to help other people. But I do believe that we're in a time when we look at all of these issues as disparate, housing over here, food over here, education over here, healthcare over here, wages over here, right? And they're really a holistic system.
Right.
And I think sometimes systems are hard to get your head around, right? It's easier almost to say, like, they need this one thing, when actually it's a system. And I do hope that we both have the ability to think about how we repair systems. I think the Poor People's Campaign is about a system and making people recognize like they all fit into this system. Racism is a part of that system. We know that if Black men are over-indexed in these fatal interactions with police officers, right, that there is a feedback loop to this overall system of poverty and injustice. So I think our goal is to bring people back around to, one, recognizing that these things all work together. As you said, you're a great example in schools. How do you educate someone if they haven't eaten? Why are we having a conversation about education if we haven't even started the conversation about they're not eating? How do we have a conversation about education when we haven't talked about access to broadband, right? All these things are not independent. They're all interrelated. And I think when you start focusing on things as systems and being interrelated, I think we then have the opportunity morally to see this as something that we need to attack and confront and challenge and change. I think it's a moral dilemma. I don't even think it's a political dilemma. I think there's a lack of political will. But I think it's a moral dilemma. We are human beings, and we're supposed to be seeing better for our fellow human beings. And it's not about, one charity doing this one thing. I'll tell you a funny story. I worked with this nonprofit years ago, and they really liked handing out backpacks to kids. But the minute you started talking about, why are their parents in poverty? Why do these kids not have access to backpacks? Why are their parents in poverty? Right, which is a story about redlining, and a story about communities that have been underfunded and defunded, and a story about how their parents don't have value in their homes, and a story about, where were their parents allowed to buy homes if they could buy homes? And it's a story about non-equality in wages, right? Everybody gets very uncomfortable. They're like, no, I just love backpacks. Me handing a backpack to a kid and I can be in that photo. But the real conversation, right, is not just I solved it by giving a backpack. It's this bigger question that involves racial equality, economic equality, and access to opportunity. And I think people who on one hand want to love their fellow man and hand them a backpack, are challenged on the other hand.
That's a great example of what we often talk about as the difference between giving charity and doing justice. Yes, it's good.
But to me, that was, how I was raised as a Catholic, right? Like the acts of faith, faith without works is dead. Like, it's just so basic. This idea of you can't just pretend to be pious or even be a pious, devout person without the other piece of it, that is the real life action of what you're supposed to be believing for Catholics about Jesus Christ. And so I find it so confounding, because it was just so central to how I was raised, that sometimes when you see this disconnect, a lot of piety, a lot of devotion, but no actual human beings involved in any of it, I think that's very problematic.
And that action has to go beyond just doing charitable works, right? The charitable work, yes, giving kids a backpack, that's fine. But at the end of the day, if we're not addressing all of the reasons that that need exists in the first place, then we're not doing the justice that needs to happen to seek to bring about equity and sustainability for their lives. What's the vision, the pathway, the insight that you would like to share for how we might build a future filled with hope for all?
So I'm going to tell you a story about a story that we're covering right now in West Louisville, Kentucky. We've been interviewing a Reverend Jamesetta Ferguson, and she's the head pastor at St. Peter's Church. And she talked about St. Peter's Church, where when she was growing up, it was a church that was only for white people. And she said, I didn't even realize the church was there. I walked by it so many times. She was brought in to interview for this position of pastor. And she said that the congregation had gone down to, I think, 12 people, maybe 14 people, and they were all in their 70s and 80s. And when she said that, I thought she meant like the leadership. And she's like, no. The congregation was 14 people. And she said that it was very interesting that this was a church in a community that had so much need, but the church didn't see themselves as having a field to play in, right? It was a very dangerous community. The church leaders would sort of read and talk about sort of religious things, but when it came to bringing acts, they didn't even look in their backyard and say, well, we could do it here. And so one of the things this Reverend Ferguson has done is to open up the church. She has turned the church into a center of a community, right? Because part of the problem was that people in the church didn't think of themselves as part of the community, and people in the community didn't think of the church as part of the community. So they never really met. And what I thought was so amazing about what she's done is she's turned it into a real estate venture. She does tutoring for students. She's got businesses moving into the property that the church owns. They feed students who are hungry. They tutor students. They do a 12-step recovery program. I'm trying to remember all the things. Study hall. What are the other things that they do? Then they have the dance programs. And then, of course, there's the church, too. I mean, all the stuff I'm listing isn't even the church part of the church. Right. And it was so interesting that it was considered very revolutionary, right, and very radical, in a way, to open up the church to the community. Even the people in the church thought, like, whoa, but we're afraid. It's a dangerous community. And I look at her as a model, right? I think when we start looking at our community as a community, not just some people, but like, how do we serve people in the community? Who needs help? And aren't we supposed to be providing help? And how do we do that? I don't think it just has to be the church. I think the government has a role to play, and we as voters need to figure out what's the role of government in helping people who've lost their jobs, or maybe who are struggling and will never be able to fully hold down a job. What's the role of government in working with nonprofit? How do they work together to leverage the resources? But I think we need to start thinking, my vision is of a community. It's like what Reverend Ferguson saw when she was invited into this church. She's like, oh, no, we're going to open up the doors and let the community in. And I think it's a similar thing, because I don't know that we can live what we're supposed to be doing if we don't do it that way. Mm-hmm. What good is a church that doesn't help the people next door? Why are you a church? Well, what good is a government that doesn't help its most vulnerable citizens, whether they're homeless or just struggling for a moment, or have mental health issues or addiction issues. Like, what is the point of having a government as a safety net if it's not actually providing a safety net? It's problematic. So I think that's my vision, is really challenging where we are at this moment and kind of figure out how do we get back to this idea of community. I'll tell you this, Reverend Ferguson made it work. She made it work. And those 14 original parishioners, most of them have passed away. They were all elderly. And the church has changed. And they have hundreds of people now who are attending the church, right? They opened up the doors and brought a community in, and the community, and it's diverse too. They saw that actual things were happening and they became part of it. And I think that metaphor can work for local government, state government, and federal government. When people feel like they're being served, then they in turn can do better and be better and help the next generation do better. So I like to think of her as a model for what I think the vision of this country can be.
You know, there is an African proverb of Ubuntu, which means I am because we are. And so as you were talking and describing about the Reverend, you know, very much this interconnected understanding that it's not just about the I, me, and myself and my little family or my little group, but rather how we are interdependent on each other, and the moral, ethical obligation that we have to live in that way if we're really going to be able to cast a vision that is one that's filled with hope, that is one that can imagine where all people can have what they need to be able to live and thrive in this country and beyond, and just believing that it is possible if we would just have the will and the desire to make that happen.
Yeah, I often think about it as a boat, right? And you cannot be in a boat, even a big boat, where there's a hole down on one end and the people are getting flooded on that end, right? You can certainly navigate that for a little bit and maybe even a long bit of time, but eventually the whole boat goes under, right? It just is not sustainable. You cannot have people in crisis on one end and everybody else saying, oh yeah, I see them. It's not me. Woo. Lucky for me, it just doesn't work like that. And one thing we've seen, certainly in public health, right, is that we are interconnected. We can only stay healthy when other people are also healthy, or it's going to impact us. It's going to impact our schools. It's going to impact our colleges. It's going to impact our food supply. It's going to impact our transportation, our housing, everything. So from a moral perspective, yes, I feel like we should have been there decades ago. And from a purely selfish perspective, a purely pragmatic, practical, me perspective, also people do better when everyone else around them is also being helped in some capacity. Our public health system relies on other people being healthy too.
Yeah. Well, as many have said, either we're all going to rise and thrive together, or it's not going to go well for us. So thank you so much, Soledad, for your time today. It's been a joy and delight to talk with you.
Thank you. Pleasure is mine.
Thank you. What a joy to talk to Soledad O'Brien and get to hear some of her thoughts about the impact of poverty in our nation all around this country. We want to now turn our attention to what's happening locally right here in Indianapolis, and to be able to think together about some of the tangible efforts that are happening and ways in which we can support those efforts. Superintendent Alicia Johnson is unable to join us today, but I am delighted to welcome Dr. Patricia Payne, the director of the IPS Racial Equity Office and the Crispus Attucks Museum, Mr. Tony Mason, the president of the Indianapolis Urban League, and Ms. Yecenia Tostado, the executive director of Project Azul. Welcome to each of you. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Now, people in Indianapolis have made huge efforts to eliminate poverty, but poverty in Indianapolis has increased at a rate greater than all but two of our peer cities since 1970. The poverty rate in Nashville and Austin has decreased since 1970, but ours has gone up by 5%. If we had the same rate today as we did in 1970, we would have 90,000 fewer people in poverty. So let's dig now into where we are and what we're seeing right now. Dr. Pat Payne, I'd like to start with you. We heard Soledad share some about the challenges that teachers and students are facing in our nation. What do you see as the emerging threats or barriers for low-income families here in Indianapolis? What are those things that are getting in the way of children receiving a quality education?
Dr. Gunning Francis, thank you so much. And please just call me Pat. That will be fine. Let me start with a quote by Brian Stevenson, who said, "My work with the poor and the incarcerated have persuaded me that the opposite of poverty is not wealth. The opposite of poverty is justice." I think that fits right in with the amazing remarks that we just heard from the interview with you and Soledad O'Brien. Yes, I am Pat Payne, and I have the honor of standing in for our distinguished superintendent, Alicia Johnson, whose leadership is totally amazing, making sure that all of our students are fed, even in this COVID environment, and that all of our families and students have devices that they can use while going through this virtual environment. But there's a reason. There's a reason why our city county council has declared racism as a public health crisis, as evidenced by the disproportionalities and the disparities that have been illuminated during COVID. They've been illuminated during COVID, but they've been here since 1619, okay? There's a reason why our school district, the Indianapolis Public Schools, has a racial equity movement policy and a Black Lives Matters policy, and all of our staff members are going through racial equity training, 2-day training, 9 to 5 p.m. And all we talk about is systemic racism and its impact on instruction. Now, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois in 1924 told us that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. So why are people poor? People do not want to be poor. So the work that we do as educators requires a mindset, I believe, in my experience, and I have been with IPS now for 58 years. I just can't leave. There's just too much work to do. The work that we do, however, requires a mindset that transcends these ingrained low expectations that are reinforced and validated through the media, through textbooks, through what I call poverty pimps, through the office of the President of the United States, and through our own belief systems. So if we are deemed worthy enough to touch the life of a child and his or her family through the work that we do, we don't have the luxury of grasping for reinforcements from these negative belief systems that are born, I believe, from deficit models that just keep regurgitating these damaging stereotypes of our children, these negative assumptions, and these deficit mindsets. Lisa Delpit said that we should expect and welcome the brilliance that our children bring to the classroom with them every day. And when you start behind, it's hard to catch up. And we always use the Monopoly game as an analogy. Now, when I was coming up, everybody got the same amount, $200. I think that has changed now. But if you start 3 to 5 hours later than anybody else, when you get in the game, everything is gone. All the hotels have been purchased. All the resources are gone. So when you land in jail, you kind of feel relieved. That's the analogy for what I see happening right now in this society. We are behind and we can't catch up. And it's just no secret that race-based discrimination has been intentionally and methodically created and maintained by the government through the racist laws and policies and neglect over many, many, many years. So the system of poverty, I heard Soledad talking about systems, and that's what we have to deal with, systems. And poverty is a system. It's a system that is an interconnected network, a framework. It's a tentacle of systemic racism. So that is what we're up against. That is what our school district is dealing with. And that is what we intend to face head on.
And we want to keep that conversation going about what it looks like to face and address these issues that you've already raised so well, as it relates just to education, because we know that for many students that are in economically disenfranchised communities, very often there's a correlation to academic achievement, and many are finding themselves falling behind. And so now that we have the impact of COVID-19 that has been placed in that mix, and so for students that were already falling behind academically, to have now the disparity that COVID-19 has caused just exacerbates the problem and highlights the urgency as to how we have to take steps now to seek to correct, to make sure that children that are most disproportionately impacted do not fall further behind. Many of whom, as you pointed out, are Black and Brown children.
Absolutely.
Tony, I'd like to turn to you to bring in some of your thoughts about this, as well as what the Urban League is doing nationally, as well as locally here in Indianapolis.
Sure, absolutely. First of all, please allow me to just express my thankfulness for being a part of today's discussion. Thinking back to the comments that were made by Soledad, everything connects to everything. And so each year, the National Urban League publishes the State of Black America. Within it, it contains an equality index, which essentially looks at how Blacks and Hispanics compare to whites in accessing the American dream, if you will, or their slice of the American pie. And so if you look at this through the lens of whites have access to 100% of the American dream, Blacks have only 73.8% access to that dream. Hispanics actually have 78.8% of that. And what makes up that pie, if you will, is social justice, economics, education, health, and civic engagement. And as Soledad shared, all of these things are so intertwined. The National Urban League, they have a number of evidence-based initiatives that are designed to get at issues that are facing African Americans and other communities of color, whether it's the Equity and Excellence Project that focuses on education and addressing the achievement gap, whether it's the Financial Empowerment Center work that they do to help families to become more literate financially and to better use and to leverage their financial resources, whether it's the Entrepreneurship Center, which is all designed to help businesses to gain access to capital, resources, training, and other assets to ensure that their businesses thrive. There are housing related initiatives as well as health programs. And so there's a number of things being done at the National Urban League, which again is the intermediary, if you will. There are 90 Urban League affiliates all across the country that are addressing these challenges, and we just happen to be one of them. We know that if you look at Indianapolis, and you just look at it at a glance, and when you think about the Black community, there are 248,000 Black people in this city. 28% of them are poor. If you look at the United Way's data around asset limited income employed constrained families, nearly 40% of all people in Indianapolis and central Indiana are either classified as poor or working poor. We know that we have, unfortunately, under-resourced schools that have been underperforming. That has been by design, where we know that 70% of Black students fail standardized tests. We know that we have issues around affordable housing in this community, which a number of agencies are attempting to address. But the sad reality is Black home ownership has declined to 31%, and that we know nearly 50,000 people are facing either eviction or foreclosure right now due to the COVID crisis. You know, if we weren't in the midst of the crisis, that number would probably be cut in half. We know that Black businesses receive essentially only 14.6% of the contracts that they may be eligible for, and those are primarily as subcontractors. So we know that Black businesses were struggling before COVID-19. Now they've been impacted at an even greater level. 70% of Blacks in this community are employed in what are considered to be bad jobs by the Brookings Institute. And then you compound these issues with many of us living in food deserts, service deserts, all in part due to redlining. And so you have a multiplicity of issues that affect a family that go far beyond any challenges that we have to address with respect to law enforcement reform. And so I can say this, as the local Urban League affiliate here, you know, every day we work to empower communities and change lives. And since 1965, we've been doing that through a myriad of workforce development and job training programs, where we not only provide training on site, but we partner with others to do everything from soft skills training to technical training and certification efforts. We work with over 100 area employers to make sure that people get access to jobs. And so we're excited about the work we do in that space. In education, we have a program called Project Ready, where we are preparing young people for post-secondary education as well as careers, because we recognize that unfortunately not everyone will be able to go to college. Maybe that may happen for some later, you know, in their lifetime, but we have to make sure that our young people are moving forward with their lives regardless of their familial circumstances. We are also involved with a myriad of health and wellness initiatives, if you will, tobacco prevention cessation. Also, we're heavily involved in the HIV/AIDS education, screening, and testing space, where we're working with thousands of people each year in that space. And to add to this effort, we recently were in partnership with the National Urban League and the African American Coalition of Indianapolis, awarded $100 million through the Lilly Endowment to launch what will be known as the Indianapolis African American Quality of Life Renewal Initiative, where essentially we're going to be focusing on working with community organizations and individuals at all levels, including the neighborhood grassroots level, to address issues that struggling Black families and families of color deal with here, ranging from education, health, housing, Black business development, individual and family strengthening, civic engagement and leadership, employment. We know that we've got lots of work to do, and all of these issues are truly intertwined. Yes, we've been a part of a number of community discussions with civic leaders, corporate CEOs, leaders from the philanthropy community, because there is an obligation on all of us to lean in to address these issues. The systemic issues that we see facing our community were not created by people of color. And so I can greatly appreciate the fact that we have the generous commitment from Lilly Endowment. We know that other corporations, Lilly, Cummins, Anthem, and the list goes on, IU Health, Pacers Sports and Entertainment, and others are all leaning in and not only bringing financial resources to bear, but in part through their individual entities, through the Greater Indianapolis Progress Committee, are looking at addressing a number of inequities. Because if we hope for Indianapolis to become the city that we aspire for it to be, you can't have 28% of African Americans living in poverty. You can't have 40% of all people living in poverty or classified as working poor.
That is so true. And thank you for bringing us up to date with all that's happening with the Urban League, both nationally and locally. And we look forward to hearing more about these efforts and how people can engage and help supporting that work. I want to keep with the strain of talking about economic mobility right now and bring in Yecenia Tostado. Yecenia, if you could share a bit about, so Soledad has talked about unemployment and wage disparity as the biggest issues keeping individuals trapped in poverty. Can you share a bit more about the business landscape in Indianapolis in terms of racial equity, and where are the opportunities that you're seeing for economic mobility?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Francis. I'm happy to be here with everyone this afternoon. So in 2018, the poverty rate for Marion County was 21% of the overall population. And when we break that down by race and ethnicity, we know that 32% of Latinos here in Marion County are in poverty, 26% of the Black population is in poverty, and 23% of the Asian population in Marion County also lives in poverty. And this is the federal poverty guidelines. So it doesn't address the numbers that Tony mentioned in his remarks about those that are working, but are struggling to make it through an emergency or a living paycheck to paycheck. And as Tony mentioned, the United Way has defined that data, and we know that about 40% of the population here in Marion County is part of that working poor or in poverty, where they may have a job, but they're not making enough to make ends meet, or they're just one emergency away from really being in a financial crisis. And again, we know that those disparities, when we break that down by race and ethnicity, that those disparities are even greater, and that they will likely increase because of the impact of COVID-19 and the disproportionate impact on our Black and Brown communities, both economically and with infection rates. So we're looking at some really bleak data when we talk about the situation. But like Soledad, I am optimistic. I think that this really powerful opportunity, this window that is open to really make a change and get us to a new normal that is better than what we had previously. So I really want to focus on some of the solutions that we can implement at all levels to really create a more equitable normal for us all. We need to look at the opportunity that we have now as a movement, not a moment. I know that there are a lot of conversations going on, and the conversations are important, but we need to make sure those conversations lead to action that lead to equitable, sustainable, long-lasting change. We cannot miss this opportunity that we have now. And as I mentioned, we need to approach it from all angles to make it happen. So we need to look towards our elected officials. And, you know, the November election is coming up. We all need to be out there and vote. But the policies that our elected officials can really impact our business outlook. They impact our economic outlook. They impact our equity in education and the opportunity to increase, funding in different areas and make a more landscape for us all. We also need to look at our community institutions and push for changes within those organizations to serve the community inclusively and to serve all members of the community. By working with employers, we know that we can advocate for the communities that we serve as nonprofit professionals. So one of the things that I think we have a great opportunity to do is to have very intentional conversations with employers in this community and dig into issues about racial inequity, dig into issues about leadership, diversity in leadership, and really encourage and provide them with tools to be able to identify skills-based opportunities that could lead to promotion, as well as experience-based opportunities that could lead to promotion. We also need to really let our employers know that I think it's a false narrative that there are not diverse candidates out there in these leadership positions. That's very much a false narrative. There are pools of very qualified candidates from diverse communities that could fill some of these open positions in senior leadership or in other levels of management. And we really need to be sure to connect employers with these candidates in an intentional way. And one of the things that I think is important for employers to know and for institutions to know is that diversifying staff will bring change in thought. And that change in thought will benefit your institution. It will benefit your employment. It will benefit your workplace. But you have to be willing to change. You have to be willing to listen to new voices. You can't just hire people on and then, not allow their voice to be heard. You have to bring them into conversations and listen to them, because that will bring about more equitable programs. It will bring about more equitable policies. It will show that representation does indeed matter. So we do need to dive into real discussions about diversity, equity, and inclusion in a sustainable, long-term way, not just this moment of conversation. And then for us in the nonprofit world, I we need to look at our program models and our services and really ask ourselves if we are doing all we can to eliminate the barriers to service and success. Are we creating additional barriers for program participants to reach success? Do we have a program model that is not practical for the participants that we serve? And again, I know that there are many organizations in this space doing great work, but this is a great opportunity to reevaluate who we are serving and whether or not we are seeing success in all the populations that we're serving. I do want to highlight briefly some of the work we're doing at Project Azul. So we're a nonprofit focused on providing individuals from underserved communities with flexible training and financial assistance needed to transition from unemployment or underemployment into full-time careers that offer higher wages, access to benefits, and a pathway to career advancement. We focus on skills-based trainings that meet employer needs. So we work very intentionally with employers. We sit down and we talk about diversity, and we advocate for the populations that we serve so that they recognize and understand all the value that these populations bring to the workplace. We also are very intentional about removing barriers for participants and meeting them where they are to support them and meet them with dignity, respect, and practical tools to support them to increase their quality of life. And we're a new nonprofit, so if you haven't heard of us yet, that's okay. We basically started our work in January of 2020, but we did have a program model that was piloted in 2018, and through it we saw great success. We saw 65% of individuals that we trained placed with our employer partners in full-time benefit jobs with a pathway to career advancement. A quarter of those individuals were unemployed before they connected to us, and ultimately they saw almost a 30% increase in hourly wages. So we saw great success through our pilot and are excited to be part of the work.
That is very great to know, helpful way to construct this broader narrative of connecting the dots the way all three of you have, and helping to highlight the systemic nature that impacts poverty and economic mobility. And as we talk about race and racism and its connection to poverty, we see that a commitment to racial equity is a commitment to eradicating poverty. Pat, I'm interested to know, in your work in training school districts and other communities in matters of racial equity, what do you say to people who don't believe that systemic racism exists, that it is just these are individual matters and individual instances, but there is not any type of systemic thing that needs to be addressed when it comes to racial equity.
I think thank you for asking that question, because I think that is one of the main reasons that this training is so important, because they do think it's just individual acts of discrimination. But no, we help people see that it is a systemic strand, and that's why we welcome community partners to go through this training with us, because this systemic strand of racism runs through everything. I call it the equal opportunity employer. And not only does it run through everything, it shapes the outcomes of everything. And we're talking about, of course, education, health, finance, housing, whatever you can think of. And even when we're talking about the good that nonprofits do, it's almost like we have to be working for the nonprofits, but also working to get people out of depending on nonprofits, because we call it the fish, the lake, and the groundwater. The fish are those individuals that are seeking assistance, like our students maybe. And this lake, this muddy lake, are the systems that are there, but they are tentacles of systemic racism. And the groundwater going through everything is what keeps everything in place. So when we're doing our training, all we talk about is systemic racism, because we feel that's the bookends that hold all the other isms firmly in place. And then we help people understand how instruction is impacted by racism, how everything is impacted by racism. And so that is why it is so important that we not only do this with our staff, but we bring in community partners to go through this with us. And while I'm talking, I also want to lift up the IPS Education Foundation. The IPS Education Foundation is in place so that we can offer assistance to those families and those students even who need help, so that we can make sure that this virus, this epidemic, this pandemic that we're going through, that we can offer assistance where needed.
That's great to know. Thank you. So Christian Theological Seminary is a school where we are training people to go into the world serving as clergy people, as counselors, as ministers in not-for-profit settings and other spaces, chaplains. And I'm very curious to hear a bit about you all's perspectives of what do you believe that faith communities can be doing to support the very kinds of efforts that we've been talking about today. Tony, what are your thoughts about that?
Sure, Dr. Francis. We know that historically the faith community, that the church has been the center of, at times, the center of Black culture, the center of Black existence and survival, if you will. And so seeing some of our local churches begin the process of reemerging and playing a greater role in outreach and in service to families is crucial. A great example of that is Eastern Star Church under the leadership of Senior Pastor Jeffrey Johnson, and the work that it's doing as a part of its ROC initiative, the Renewing Our Community for the Kingdom effort, where they are essentially revitalizing housing and creating jobs in the 46218 zip code, and knowing that for that neighborhood, it will have a chance at the Black families that have lived there for decades remaining there, that there will be viable, affordable housing, access to services, whether it be access to the store, access to healthcare, you name it. And so that's an example that comes to mind We know that there are other faith-based organizations that are doing great work in this community as well. We've partnered with the Hovey Street Church and provided them with resources to help them to address access to food issues in the area that they're serving. We've done the same thing with the Northwest Faith Partners and the First Baptist Church with Reverend Ivan Hicks. And so we know that what's going to be crucial is that we not just put all of the burden on the faith-based community, but that organizations like the Urban League, that corporations and municipal leaders would work with churches as well to make sure that they have the resources that are needed, because oftentimes that's where people turn to. And they're not just turning to the church for prayer. Sometimes it's about sustenance, it's access to food, it's access to resources to pay bills. And so there's most certainly an important role to play. And, we're thankful to be a partner with Eastern Star Church and others to do that work in the community. I did want to piggyback, if you don't mind, on Pat's comments with respect to just things that we know that are happening in this community, and the acknowledgement around systemic racism, institutional racism. You have to look no further than an organization like the Central Indiana Community Foundation, which changed its mission to focus on equity and racism, and is trying to put thousands of people through undoing racism training. You have to look no further than the Indy Chamber, the Central Indiana Corporate Partnership, Ascend Indiana, who are all launching efforts to get at and to address disparities and inequities within business, whether that be hiring people of color for jobs, promoting them from within corporations, bringing people to their board of directors, looking at their supplier diversity efforts. And so I know a number of us are part of those conversations, and I know Yecenia is a part of that as well. We know that when we look at other areas such as hunger relief and food related issues, the work that has been being done by the mayor through its food insecurity effort, the work that's being done by Gleaners, Second Helpings is crucial in that space. And then also with the mayor's office, the Indy Rents Assistance effort, there's some intentionality around helping people from distressed zip codes and neighborhoods who are facing eviction. We are one of maybe 14 or 15 organizations that are a part of that effort along with the Bonner Center. And I can tell you through the Urban League alone, since mid-July, we have written rent checks to help over 500 families to the tune of almost $1.4 million. And so we know the struggle is real, and a lot of it is systemic, and we've got a lot of work to do to help families to subsist. And faith is an important part of that. And so I say that because these other activities and initiatives that are being launched from different sectors in the community are going to be important. And so I say that because I want our community to have faith, even though this is a very challenging moment in time.
Dr. Gunning, I wanted to lift up what the Whitewater Presbytery is doing, and I'm lifting that up because we want to see what white churches are doing about this also. And our presbytery I am a Presbyterian, but it is mainly made up of white Presbyterians. But the Whitewater Presbyterian has a design team for dismantling racism. And we are sponsoring these conversations and dealing with curriculum and resources so that people can start talking about this. If we don't start talking about it, if we don't come together and share our perspectives on this, then nothing is going to happen. So I'm just kind of very proud that this is going on in the presbytery. So I did want to lift that up.
That's a great example of a way in which a congregation, a denomination can engage in this work of dismantling racism, working toward racial equity, because again, we can't stress enough that to really work for racial equity is to work against poverty and work toward economic mobility for all. As we prepare to wrap up, we're coming near the end of our time. I know there is so much more that we could talk about on this really important and urgent topic. I want to give each of you just a minute to share some last words about what would you like to see our audience do after they leave this call? What are some very tangible things that individuals that are watching today, what's a next step that you would like to see folks take? Yecenia, let's start with you, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So I really want to empower everyone to get involved, find a way to get involved, dig into these conversationals, be intentional about the opportunities to learn, but be ready to move beyond the conversation and into action. And as I mentioned earlier, action can look many different ways. So there's not one prescription of how you need to take your next step, but be ready to assess the places where you have power and be willing to use your power to influence the systems. Look at the resources you have. What are the resources that you have that you can share with others to make the future for everyone in this city more equitable, more inclusive, to lift individuals out of poverty. If you're eligible to vote. That's very important. We know that every election is important, but this one is especially critical because it's really going to define our legacy as a country this year and what we value. So again, no matter who you are, what you do, know that you can do something. So sit and reflect and ask yourself, what can I do from where I sit to make a difference?
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. Tony, how about you?
Sure, and I know we're about to close, but I want to thank you, Dr. Gunning, and the Christian Theological Seminary for staging these discussions each and every year and calling attention to these critical issues. I would say to everyone that is participating today, make sure you vote. I'm sure you watched the debate last night. Make sure you vote. Make sure you complete the census. The census impacts dollars that come back to our community. And while we have eclipsed the self-response rate from 10 years ago, we're at 65.6% now, and maybe a little over 90% total enumeration. Everyone needs to complete the census. We need those resources for struggling families. And then make sure, no matter what your position or station is in this community, that if you're involved with your church, your company, or your community organization, your fraternity or sorority, get involved with helping people. Get out here, serve, lead, re-engage, because part of the challenge now is making sure that we have people engaged as volunteers, as leaders, because it's a heavy burden for nonprofits to carry, for the churches to carry, if you will, and it takes people, and it takes a commitment to truly being our brother and sisters keepers, sharing our time, talent, and treasures. So please get involved.
Thank you so much. Pat?
I ditto everything my colleagues have said, especially get out and vote. Please get out and vote. What we don't need more of is missionaries. We don't need people who are coming to feel sorry for our children. We need people who are in there willing to work and to lift up who our children are and the brilliance that they bring with them. We need people who are going to help us do this. We are so tired of being able to predict who's going to be at the bottom even before the test is given. And so we need people that are going to help us do one thing, find the way where our student outcomes can no longer be predicted by race or ethnicity. That is my big ask.
And that is an important ask and just reinforces the need for there to be a true commitment to racial equity in education, in healthcare, in economic development, in our business community, our philanthropic community, all of those things working together with a genuine emphasis in racial equity can make a significant improvement toward being able to eliminate poverty in Indianapolis and around the country. Thank each of you for your wonderful contributions today. Remember, early voting begins October 6th here in Indiana. And so we hope that each person watching will exercise their civic duty as you deem appropriate. Thank you to all of our sponsors and for your ongoing support of Christian Theological Seminary. Thank you. God bless.